The repercussions of the French Revolution had spread throughout Europe since the fall of the Bastille, and even more definitely after the outbreak of war in 1792 and the ensuing victories of the French Republican armies. They became even more evident after the Republican General Bonaparte turned into Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, King of Italy, and protector of the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon surpassed all previous European rulers in imposing a broad political unity on the European continent. Although his imperial power collapsed in less than 15 years, his military campaigns and political ascendancy transformed both international relations in Europe and the internal development of the various European peoples. The French impact on other nations, though based on military success, represented more than mere forcible subjugation. Many of the legal and social innovations that came to France through revolution were brought to other countries in the early 19th century by administrative decree and by collaborating local leaders. There were Germans, Italians, Dutch, and Poles who worked with the French emperor to introduce the changes that he demanded and that they themselves often desired. In Prussia, it was the resistance to Napoleon that gave the incentive to internal reorganization and fostered the emergence of a new German nationalism. Whether by collaboration or resistance, Europe was transformed. It is convenient to think of the fighting from 1792 to 1814 as the first modern total war, or as a world war. It affected not only all of Europe, but also places as far away as Latin America, where the wars of independence began, or the interior of North America, where the United States purchased Louisiana in 1803 and attempted a conquest of Canada in the War of 1812. But it is important to realize that this World War was actually a series of wars, most of them quite short and distinct. Only Great Britain remained continually at war with France, except for about a year of peace in 1802 to 1803. Never were the four great European powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, simultaneously waging war against France until 1813. 421 766, the history of the Napoleonic period would be much simpler if the European governments had fought merely to protect themselves against the aggressive French. Each, however, in its way, was as dynamic and expansive as Napoleon himself. For some generations, Great Britain had been building a global commercial empire. Russia had been pushing upon Poland and Turkey, and Prussia had been consolidating its territories and striving for leadership in North Germany. Austria was less aggressive, but the Austrians were not without their own dreams of ascendancy in Germany, the Balkans, and the Adriatic. None of these ambitions ceased during the Napoleonic years. governments, in pursuit of their own expansive aims, were quite as willing to ally with Napoleon as to fight him. Only gradually, and under repeated provocation, did they conclude that their main interest was to dispose of the French emperor entirely. 47. The formation of the French imperial system. The collapse of the First and Second Coalitions, 1792 to 1802. The conflicting purposes of the major European powers had been apparent from almost the beginning of the French Revolution. Leopold of Austria, in issuing the Declaration of Pillnitz in 1791, had believed a general European coalition against France to be impossible. When war began in 1792, the Austrians and Prussians kept their main forces in Eastern Europe, more afraid of each other and of Russia in the matter of Poland than of the French Revolutionary Republic. Indeed, the main accomplishment of the First Coalition was the partition of Poland and the dissolution of the Polish state. In 1795, the French broke up the coalition. The British withdrew their army from the continent. Prussia and Spain each made a separate peace with France. Indeed, Bourbon Spain, acting for reasons of strategic self-interest that ignored all ideology or principle, formed an alliance with the French Republic that had guillotined Louis XVI and kept Louis XVIII from his monarchic rights. Spain simply reverted to an earlier 18th century pattern in allying with France because of hostility to Great 767 Britain, whose possession of Gibraltar, naval influence in the Mediterranean, and attitude toward the Spanish Empire were disquieting to the Spanish government. When Austria signed the Peace of Campo Formio in 1797, the First Coalition was totally dissipated, only British naval forces remaining engaged with the French. The First Coalition disintegrates. The Second Coalition of 1799 fared no better. After the British fleet defeated the French at the Battle of the Nile, cutting off the French army in Egypt, the Russians saw their ambitions in the Mediterranean blocked mainly by the British and withdrew Suvorov's army from Western Europe. Austria's acceptance of the Peace of Luneville in 1801 dissolved the Second Coalition, and in 1802, Great Britain signed the Peace of Amiens. For the only time between 1792 and 1814, no European power was at war with another. Peace interim, 1802 to 1803. Never had a peace been so advantageous to France as the Peace of 1802, but Bonaparte's ambitions gave it no chance to endure. He used peace as he did war to advance his interests. Seeking to re-establish slavery in the French Caribbean islands, Bonaparte dispatched a sizable army to Saint-Domingue, where, as noted earlier, the French forces suffered a major defeat and the Republic of Haiti emerged as a new independent state. Although he had wanted to suppress Toussaint Louverture and reassert imperial power over a colonial population that was slipping away from French control, Bonaparte sent this army with the additional and wider goal of reviving France's colonial empire in America. Spain had ceded Louisiana back to France in 1800, giving the French a base for expanding their 422,768 influence in the Caribbean. But this plan collapsed when France failed to defeat the revolutionary movement in Saint-Domingue. Bonaparte therefore decided to sell the Louisiana territories to the United States. And the Haitian Revolution, which prevented the restoration of slavery in a long-held French colony and created a new national state, also contributed directly to a vast expansion of the new republic in North America. Meanwhile, within the French-dominated territories of continental Europe, Bonaparte reorganized the Helvetic Republic, making himself mediator of the Confederation of Switzerland. He reorganized Germany. That is to say, he and his agents closely watched the rearrangement of territory that the Germans themselves had been carrying out since 1797. The War for Haitian Independence was a brutal conflict that caused very high casualties on both sides. It led to the complete French withdrawal from their longtime colony of Saint-Domingue and the creation of the Republic of Haiti in 1804. Napoleon's failure to repress a guerrilla-style military resistance, as depicted in this image of a Haitian battle with French troops, became a prelude to future failures in a similar war in Spain. Bettman, Getty Images. 769, by the Treaty of Campo Formio, it will be recalled, German princes of the left bank of the Rhine, expropriated by the annexation of their dominions to the French Republic, were to receive new territories on the right bank. The result was a scramble that later patriotic German historians called the Shame of the Princes. The German rulers, far from opposing Bonaparte or upholding any national interests, competed desperately for the acquisition of various German territories, each bribing and fawning upon the French to win French support against other Germans. Talleyrand made over 10 million francs in this process. The Holy Roman Empire was fatally mauled by the Germans themselves. Most of its 423 ecclesiastical principalities and 45 out of its 51 free cities disappeared, annexed by their larger neighbors. The number of states in the Holy Roman Empire was greatly reduced, but Prussia, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden consolidated and enlarged themselves. These arrangements were ratified in February 1803 by the Diet of the Empire. The enlarged German states now depended on Bonaparte for the maintenance of their newly enhanced position. The shame of the princes. Formation of the Third Coalition in 1805. Britain and France went to war again in 1803. Bonaparte, his communications with America menaced by the British Navy, and his army in Haiti decimated by disease and by the military campaigns of the Haitian independence movement, had suspended his ideas for recreating an American empire. In May 1804, however, he pronounced himself to be Emperor Napoleon of the French to ensure the hereditary permanency of his imperial system in Europe, though at the time he had no heir. Francis II of Austria, seeing the Holy Roman Empire in ruins, promulgated the Austrian Empire in August 1804. He thus advanced the long process of integrating the Danubian monarchy. In 1805, Austria signed an alliance 770 with Great Britain, and the Third Coalition was soon completed by the accession of the Russian Tsar Alexander I, who, after Napoleon himself, was to become the most prominent figure on the early 19th century European stage. Tsar Alexander I. Alexander was the grandson of Catherine the Great, educated by her to be a kind of enlightened despot on the 18th century model. The Swiss tutor of his boyhood, La Harpe, later turned up as a pro-French revolutionary in the Helvetic Republic of 1798. Alexander became Tsar in 1801 at the age of 24 through a palace revolution that implicated him in the murder of his father Paul. He still corresponded with La Harpe, and he surrounded himself with a circle of liberal young men of various nationalities, of whom the most influential was the young Polish diplomat Adam Jerzy Czartoryski. Alexander regarded the still recent partitions of Poland as a crime. Encouraged by Czartoryski, he wished to restore the unity of Poland with himself as a constitutional king. In Germany, many who had first warmed to the French Revolution, but had become disillusioned, began to hail the new liberal Tsar as the protector of Germany and hope of the future. Alexander perceived himself as a rival to Napoleon in guiding the destinies of Europe in an age of change. Moralistic and self-righteous, he puzzled and disturbed the statesmen of Europe, who generally saw behind his humane utterances either an enthroned leader of all the Jacobins of Europe or the familiar specter of Russian aggrandizement. Yet Alexander, more than his contemporaries, formed a conception of international peace and collective security. He declared that the issue in Europe was clearly between law and force, between an international society in which the rights of each member were secured by international agreement and organization, and a society in which all trembled before the rule of cynicism and conquest, embodied in the French imperial usurper. 771, Alexander was therefore ready to enter a third coalition with Great Britain. Picturing himself as a future arbiter of Poland and Central Europe, and with secret designs on the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean, he signed a treaty with England in April 1805. The British agreed to pay Russia £1,250,000 for each 100,000 soldiers that the Russians raised. The Third Coalition, 1805 to 1807, the Peace of Tilsit. Napoleon, meanwhile, since the resumption of hostilities in 1803, had been making preparations to invade England. He concentrated large forces on the Channel coast, together with thousands of boats and barges, in which he gave the troops amphibious training in 424 embarkation and debarkation. He reasoned that if his own fleet could divert or cripple the British fleet for a few days, he could place enough soldiers on the defenseless island to force its capitulation. The British, sensing mortal danger, lined their coasts with lookouts and signal beacons and set to drilling a home guard. Their main defense was twofold: the Austro-Russian armies on the continent and the British fleet under Lord Nelson. The Russian and Austrian armies moved westward in the summer of 1805. In August, Napoleon relieved the pressure upon England, shifting 7 army corps from the Channel to the upper Danube. On October 15th, he surrounded an Austrian force of 50,000 men at Ulm in Bavaria, forcing it to surrender without resistance. On October 21st, Lord Nelson, off Cape Trafalgar on the Spanish coast, caught and annihilated the main body of the combined fleets of France and Spain. The Battle of Trafalgar established the supremacy of the British Navy for over a century, but only on the proviso that Napoleon be prevented from controlling most of Europe, which could furnish an ample base for eventual construction of a greater navy than the British. And to control Europe was precisely what Napoleon proceeded to do. Moving east from Ulm, he came upon the Russian and Austrian armies in Moravia, where on December 2nd he won the great victory of Austerlitz. The broken Russian army withdrew into Poland, and Austria made peace. By the 772 Treaty of Pressburg, Napoleon took Venetia from the Austrians, to whom he had given it in 1797, and annexed it to his Kingdom of Italy, the former Cisalpine and Italian Republic, which now included much of Italy north of Rome. Venice and Trieste soon resounded with the hammers of shipwrights rebuilding the Napoleonic fleet. In Germany, early in 1806, the French emperor raised Bavaria and Württemberg to the stature of kingdoms and Baden to a grand duchy. The Holy Roman Empire was finally, formally, and irrevocably dissolved. In its place, Napoleon began to gather his German client states into a new kind of Germanic federation, the Confederation of the Rhine, of which he made himself the protector. British victory at Trafalgar, Prussia, at peace with France for 10 years, had declined to join the Third Coalition. But as Napoleon's program for controlling Germany became clear after Austerlitz, the war party in Prussia became irresistible, and the Prussian government now went to war with the French unaided and alone. The French smashed the famous Prussian army at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt in October 1806. The French cavalry galloped all over North Germany unopposed. The Prussian king and his government took refuge in the east, at Königsberg, where the Tsar and the reforming Russian army might protect them. But the terrible Corsican pursued the Russians also. Marching through western Poland and into East Prussia, he met the Russian army first at the sanguinary but indecisive Battle of Eylau, and then defeated it on June 14, 1807, at Friedland. Alexander I was unwilling to continue the war by retreating into Russia. He was unsure of his own resources. If the country were invaded, there might be a revolt of the nobles or even of the serfs, for people still remembered the Great Serf Rebellion of the 1770s. Alexander feared also merely playing the game of the British. He put aside his war aims of 1804 and signified his willingness to negotiate with Napoleon. The Third Coalition had gone the way of the two before it. 773, the Third Coalition collapses. The Emperor of the French and the autocrat of all the Russias met privately on a raft in the Niemen River, not far from the border between Prussia and Russia, the very easternmost frontier of modern or civilized Europe, as the triumphant Napoleon gleefully imagined it. The hapless Prussian king, Frederick William III, paced nervously on the bank while the two imperial rulers discussed their visions for the whole European continent. Bonaparte turned all his charm upon Alexander, denouncing England as the 425 author of all the troubles of Europe, and setting before Alexander an imagined boundless destiny as Emperor of the East, intimating that Russia's future lay toward Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan, and India. The result of their conversations was the Treaty of Tilsit of July 1807, in many ways the high point of Napoleon's success. The French and Russian empires became allies, mainly against Great Britain. Ostensibly, this alliance lasted for 5 years. Alexander accepted Napoleon as a kind of emperor of the West. As for Prussia, Napoleon continued to occupy Berlin with French troops, and he took away all Prussian territories west of the Elbe, combining them with others taken from Hanover to make a new kingdom of Westphalia, which became part of his Confederation of the Rhine. The Treaty of Tilsit. The continental system and the war in Spain. Hardly had the peace of the continent been reestablished on the foundation of a Franco-Russian alliance when Napoleon began to have serious trouble. He was bent on subduing the British who, secure on their island, seemed beyond his reach. Since the French naval disaster at Trafalgar, there was no possibility of invading England in the foreseeable 774 future. Napoleon therefore turned to economic warfare. He would fight sea power with land power, using his political control of the continent to shut out British goods and to block shipping to Britain from all European ports. He would destroy the British trade and exports to Europe, both exports of British products and the profitable British re-export of goods from America and Asia. The overall strategy, as Napoleon planned it, was to ruin British commercial firms and cause a violent business depression marked by overloaded warehouses, unemployment, a fall of the currency, rising prices, and revolutionary agitation. The British government, which would simultaneously be losing revenues from its customs duties, would thus find itself unable to carry the enormous national debt, or to borrow additional funds from its subjects, or to continue its financial subsidies to the military powers of Europe. At Berlin in 1806, after the Battle of Jena, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, forbidding the importation of British goods into any part of Europe, allied with or dependent on himself. He in that way formally established the continental system. Economic warfare. To make the continental system effective, Napoleon believed that it must extend to all continental Europe, without exception. By the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, he required both Russia and Prussia to adhere to it. They agreed to exclude all British goods. In fact, in the following months, Russia, Prussia, and Austria all declared war on Great Britain. Napoleon then ordered two neutral states, Denmark and Portugal, to adhere to his exclusionary commercial system. Denmark was an important entrepot for all Central Europe, and the British, fearing Danish compliance, dispatched a fleet to Copenhagen, bombarded the city for 4 days, and took captive the Danish fleet. The outraged Danes allied with Napoleon and joined the continental system. Portugal, long a satellite of Britain, refused compliance. Napoleon invaded it. To control the whole European coastline from St. Petersburg around to Trieste, he now had only to control the ports of Spain. By a series of deceptions, he got both the Bourbon Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to abdicate the Spanish 775th throne, whereupon the young Ferdinand was imprisoned in France. He then made his own brother Joseph King of Spain in 1808 and reinforced him with a large French army. He thus involved himself in an Iberian entanglement from which he never escaped. The Spanish regarded the Napoleonic soldiers as godless villains who desecrated churches. Fierce guerrillas took the field. Cruelties of one side were answered by atrocities of the other. The British sent an expeditionary force of their small regular army, eventually under the Duke of Wellington, to sustain the Spanish guerrillas. The resulting Peninsular War dragged on for 5 years. But from the beginning, the affair went badly for Napoleon. In July 1808, 426, a French general, for the first time since the Revolution, surrendered an entire army corps, which had been surrounded and forced to capitulate at Bailen. In August, another French force surrendered to the British army in Portugal, and these events raised hopes in the rest of Europe. An anti-French movement swept over Germany. It was felt strongly in Austria, where the Habsburg government, undaunted by 3 defeats and hoping to lead a general German national resistance, prepared for a 4th time since 1792 to go to war with France. 776. This meeting between Napoleon and Russia's Alexander I on the Niemen River produced an alliance and an agreement on the continental system. The new system was aimed against the British, but Alexander soon disliked the restrictions on Anglo-Russian commerce. His withdrawal from the continental system provoked Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. Rare book collection, Wilson's Special Collections Library, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, The Peninsular War in Spain. The Austrian War of Liberation, 1809. Napoleon convened a General Congress of European leaders at Erfurt in Saxony in September 1808. His main purpose was to talk with his ally of a year, Alexander, but he assembled numerous dependent monarchs as well, by whose presence he hoped to overawe the Tsar. He even had Talma, the leading actor of the day, play in the theater of Erfurt before a parterre of kings. Alexander was unimpressed. He was hurt in a sensitive spot because Napoleon had recently made moves without Russian involvement to recreate a Polish state, setting up what was called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. This was not the kind of Polish state that Alexander had envisioned, and he had also found Napoleon unwilling, despite the grandiose language of Tilsit, really to support his expansion into the Balkans. In addition, Alexander was taken aside by Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister. Talleyrand had concluded that Napoleon was overreaching himself and said so confidentially to the Tsar, advising him to wait for future opportunities. Talleyrand thus betrayed the man whom he ostensibly 427 served and prepared a safe place for himself in the event of Napoleon's fall. But he acted also as an aristocrat of the pre-nationalistic old regime, seeing his own country as only one part of the whole of Europe, believing a balance among the several parts to be necessary, and holding that peace would be possible only when the exaggerated reach of French power, 777, would be reduced. For France and Russia, the two strongest states, to combine against all other states was contrary to all principles of the older diplomacy. Talleyrand Austria proclaimed a war of liberation in April 1809. Napoleon advanced rapidly along the familiar route to Vienna. The German princes, indebted to the French, declined to join in a general German war against him. Alexander stood watchfully on the sidelines. Napoleon won the Battle of Wagram in July. In October, Austria made peace. The short war of 1809 was over. The Danubian monarchy, by no means as fragile as it seemed, survived a fourth defeat at the hands of the French without internal revolution or disloyalty to the Habsburg house. From it, in punishment, Napoleon took part of Austrian Poland to enlarge the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and he took parts of Austrian-controlled Dalmatia, Slovenia, and Croatia to establish a new creation that Napoleon called the Illyrian provinces. See map, p. 433. Napoleon at his peak, 1809 to 1811. The next 2 years saw the Napoleonic Empire at its peak. In Austria, after the defeat of 1809, the conduct of foreign affairs fell to Clemens von Metternich, who was to remain the Austrian foreign minister for 40 years. He was a German from west of the Rhine, whose ancestral territories had been annexed to the French Republic, but he had entered the Austrian service and even married the granddaughter of Kaunitz, the old model of diplomatic savoir-faire, of which Metternich now became a model himself. Austria had been repeatedly humiliated and even partitioned by Napoleon, but Metternich was not inclined to conduct diplomacy by grudges, believing that Russia was the really permanent problem for a state situated in the Danube Valley. Metternich thought it wise to renew 778 good relations with France. He was quite willing to go along with Napoleon, whom he knew personally, having been Austrian ambassador to Paris before the short war of 1809. Metternich. The French emperor, who in 1809 was exactly 40, was increasingly concerned by the fact that he was childless. He had made an empire that he pronounced hereditary, yet he had no heir. Between him and his wife Josephine, whom he had married in youth and who was 6 years his senior, there had long since ceased to be affection or even fidelity on either side. He divorced her in 1809, though she protested that Napoleon's childlessness was not her fault. She had 2 children by a first husband. He intended to marry a younger woman who might bear him offspring. He intended also to make a spectacular marriage, to extort for himself a self-made Corsican army officer, the highest and most exclusive recognition that aristocratic Europe could bestow. Tactful inquiries at St. Petersburg concerning the availability of Alexander's sister were tactfully rebuffed. The Tsar intimated that his mother would never allow it. The Russian alliance again showed its limitations. Napoleon was thus thrown into the arms of Metternich and of Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of the Austrian emperor and niece of another Austrian woman, Marie Antoinette. They were married in 1810. In a year, she bore him a son, whom he entitled the King of Rome. Napoleon assumed ever more pompous airs of imperial majesty. He was now, by marriage, the nephew of Louis XVI. He showed more consideration to French noblemen of the old regime. Only they, he said, knew really how to serve. He surrounded himself with a newly made hereditary Napoleonic nobility, hoping that the new families, as time 428 went on, would bind their own fortunes to the House of Bonaparte. The marshals became dukes and princes. Talleyrand became the Prince of Benevento, and the bourgeois Fouché, an Hebertist radical in 1793 and more latterly a police official, was now solemnly addressed as the Duke of 779 Otranto. In foreign affairs, also older diplomatic relations seem to be reappearing. With the significant exception of Great Britain, all the powers of the successive coalitions were allied with the French, and the son of the revolution now gravely referred to the Emperor of Austria as my father. The 3rd of May, 1808, by Francisco de Goya, Spanish 1746 to 1828. Facing steadfast resistance to their military occupation of Spain, the French army committed atrocities such as the brutal scene that Goya portrayed in this image of the Peninsular War.